Hi, my name is Matthias. I'm working for SAP, and I'm going to show you what we're currently doing to deploy Gerrit on Kubernetes. Most of the work I'm presenting was done by Thomas Drebing. He's a new team member in my team, and he implemented most of what I'm showing. This is where we started from. Probably everyone here in this room. So you start with a Gerrit master. You probably run a GC, and at least until 3.0, there's still a database. And then when the load goes up, you will start looking into the replication plugin and set up slaves. One way to do that is to run Apache on the slave, which is then receiving the transport from the master. New repositories which are not yet available on the slave are created typically through SSH, and pushes you can either do also through SSH or through HTTP. And of course, there's also a database on the slave, which also needs to fetch updates from the database master, from the Gerrit master. And then a Gerrit slave is running there to serve the requests in order to serve the repositories, typically, for example, to all your build servers. And then if the load is keep getting higher, of course, you also need to run GC there on the slaves. And when the load goes up, because you have more and more build servers, you just keep adding slaves. Maintaining those slaves was quite some work. So the next thing we did is Dockerize the slaves. So nowadays we run the slaves we use on Docker. And now we were thinking about how we can further improve on that. We're having containers running on the container runtime on VMs underneath. And this brings quite some benefits. So isolation, immutable infrastructure, faster deployments, versioning, and so on. But there are also challenges with that. So networking might be tricky. Security is not so easy. Handling all those deployments, service discovery, and so on is adding more and more complexity. Container schedulers come to the rescue. So Docker Swarm, Mesos, or Kubernetes. We have chosen Kubernetes because SAP is also looking at moving a lot of the workloads we run onto Kubernetes. And with Kubernetes, we can get a better orchestration of the containers, clusters of containers. And Kubernetes will care for automatically placing the containers on nodes which have free capacity. It will help a lot in networking, what you saw this morning from what Luke explained. It helps a lot to handle deployments, to do scaling, auto-scaling, and so on. And one big difference to just using Docker is it's a declarative way of setting up your deployments. So you just declare the target state, you throw some resources at the API server of Kubernetes, and then Kubernetes will do all the rest. Kubernetes is also prepared to provide self-healing, so if something goes wrong, some containers don't work anymore, they will be automatically restarted. And furthermore, with Kubernetes, you get also more portability because Kubernetes helps to abstract from the underlying infrastructure. And it also provides integration with different container runtimes. So the next step we started beginning of this year was to start working on deploying Gerrit slaves on Kubernetes. We decided to first start with the slaves because that's the lowest risk. So if you want to gather experience in production, if a slave goes down, the impact is much less than if the master has a problem. So what we have now is a Helm chart, which can be used to deploy the slave. And then there are several deployments inside that. One is for the Apache web server, which is receiving the incoming pack files from master. Then we have the Gerrit slave. That's another deployment. And this deployment depends then on the MySQL Helm chart, so that Helm will automatically first deploy the MySQL slave and later on the Gerrit slave. In order to set up the slave database, we also need to initialize the database with a backup from the master. This is done through an init container, which runs when the MySQL pod comes up. First, the init container will be executed, and that will wait until the database backup is imported into the database, and then it will automatically start up the database. In a similar way, there's an init container in the Gerrit slave pod, which waits for the database to be ready and also for the Git replication to be ready. So it waits until all projects repository arrives through replication, and then the Gerrit slave will start up. In the first deployment, we just took an NFS as a storage. This is not something we will use in production probably, so we plan to use what Luke showed to go into the direction of safe. Okay, and then what we have reached this week is that we have a full setup in Kubernetes. So now we have also another Helm chart for installing the Gerrit master in a similar way. It's a bit simpler because there's no Apache in that, and the configuration is of course different. So this means we can now set up a complete cluster consisting of one master and one slave. We're not there yet to also provide multiple slaves. We already have foreseen replica set there and also here. But if you want to run multiple masters, we need to add more HA plugin and what Luca explained yesterday. So there are quite some steps ahead of us. So this is still in a POC state, but it's up and running. And the GC we run as a cron job, but it's not a cron job in the operating system, but a Kubernetes cron job. So this means that whenever the cron schedule says a GC should run, then this job will be started by Kubernetes, will bring up a pod, and this will then run the GC. Now, one word about how we deploy Kubernetes clusters at SAP. Since we have a multi-cloud strategy, we want to be able to deploy Kubernetes clusters in a uniform way on all the different infrastructures our customers want to use. And for that, we have started an open source project last year. It's called Gardener. And this works based on a hierarchy of Kubernetes clusters. There's a central HA cluster called the Gardener cluster, which is controlling all the clusters we are managing. It has a traditional setup, so it has an HA setup of the control plane and a number of worker nodes. And then in each data center and region, there's one or multiple seed clusters which do all the work which needs to be close to the workload of the customers. And then in order to create a cluster which runs the workload in the end, you have to just write a cluster definition. So the Gardener extends the Kubernetes API so that you can just deploy a new Kubernetes cluster by putting a custom resource definition into the Gardener cluster. And this will then spin up a new shoot cluster. And this you can, of course, then repeat. So all the clusters the customers will use, those ones, controlled through this hierarchy of Kubernetes clusters. And now if you look into the worker node of a seed cluster, we will find the control plane of the shoot clusters. So we don't run the control planes of the shoots in a traditional way on dedicated VMs, but we run them in containers managed by the seed cluster. And this saves a lot of resources and also helps to avoid that you need HA, because restarting a container is much faster than restarting a VM. And this is the infrastructure we also use for we intend to use also for our Gerrit clusters in the future. And Gardener is also caring about spinning up additional machines through a machine controller manager, which also brings the underlying machines under Kubernetes control. So basically, it's a way to use Kubernetes to run Kubernetes. And this runs currently on all the big infrastructure providers, so Microsoft Azure, Amazon, Alibaba, and Google Cloud, and also OpenStack. Now to the Gardener comes with a dashboard where you can easily just spin up new clusters or configure them on all the different infrastructures and regions and data centers. What I can show is the master, which I installed in Kubernetes. This is a 216 Gerrit master running in a Kubernetes cluster. Now, the next steps, what we intend to work next on is to replace the NFS underneath the Gerrit installations by Ceph Rook combination, what Luke showed this morning. We also want to update the chart so that we can also use the master branch of Gerrit, because then we get rid of the database setup, which is adding quite some complexity to the setup, especially because you first need a backup of the database to transfer from the master database to the slave database, which is quite complex. We also want to replace Lucene by Elasticsearch. That's pretty obvious. We think that over time we will probably implement the Gerrit operator in order to implement the more complex stuff like sharding, multi-master, and things like auto-scaling, where you need application-specific knowledge in order to decide when to add more resources or to remove resources if the load goes down. For logging, we also already did some experiments. So we have one cluster in our dev landscape where we set up the typical EFK stack, so Elasticsearch for indexing, FluentBit for the log collection. So that's a small component running on each of the pods in the sidecar, which just grabs the logs and sends them to Elasticsearch. And then, like Luca showed this morning, Kibana to look into the data. And for monitoring, we will use Prometheus. So we will probably use the Prometheus connector to grab the data from the Gerrit source and use Grafana for the visualization. And this is all open source. So this week we created a new repository on Gerrit, googlesource.com. So we are looking for others intending to go in the same direction. So here are the links. This is the Git repository. The Docker images are on Docker Hub. And if you're interested in Gardener, this is the homepage. That's also an open source project, so you can also just go there and give it a try.
Yeah, so thanks for the talk. One thing I missed, is this live in production at SAP now, or is it still in like testing phases?
You mean the setup of Gerrit? This is still in a POC phase, so it's not yet in production. So what we want to do soon is to bring some slaves running on Kubernetes into production. And then we first want to gather some experience, because the underlying Gardener infrastructure is also not yet in production. So they will go live beginning next year.
I had a look at the repo a while ago, but I don't remember seeing if you had enabled SSH on it yet for the Gerrit and stuff.
We didn't yet do that, no.
Oh, okay. Do you think you will?
I'm not yet sure.
Cool.
Because it's also adding some complexity again.
It is, yeah, okay.
I think we will rather go for HTTP only.
Maybe I'll contribute something. I will have a look.